It took the wizard nearly 3 years to acquire the tome that contained the ritual. Sacrifices had been made, measures had been taken. He did his utmost to bury his regrets. In the end, the only thing which mattered to him was that he possessed it. Its exterior was less impressive to behold than one would expect. A book bound in soft leather, with little indication of the power swelling inside. Inscribed on the pages within was a language that reached from the mists of the far past, esoteric in both its aromatic ink and its symbols. For a month he worked to decipher the text. It took him even longer to master the syllables and gestures necessary for the execution of the ritual. Once he was confident in his ability to perform the rite, he donned a clean white robe just after dawn. He lit 6 wedges of incense taken from the vaults of grand temples in distant lands. He marked the symbols from the tome on the floor with a chalk-like reagent made from the cremated body of a sphinx. He recited phrase after phrase in a long-forgotten tongue. His words resounded throughout his private chamber at an unhurried pace. The recitation became a chant, which grew into an ardent command. At the culmination of the ritual, the tome burst into flame and billowing smoke. The smoke engulfed him, and he felt as if he was simultaneously falling and being flung upwards. After an unknown length of time, he was suddenly aware of the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. The wizard looked around and saw he stood upon a large disc-shaped surface made of smooth stone. This platform rose out of a bay of sorts. Not far away, shallow, crystal-clear waters lapped lazily upon a bank of sand. Just beyond there was a hill covered in golden grass that waved with a sweet breeze. Atop the hill was a glorious tower made out of alabaster marble. In the warmth of the sunlight, the radiance of the tower gleamed across the whole of the site. He was not alone. Nearby on the platform was a large creature that seemed to be made out of the same stone. Its shape was that of a giant man, though it was mostly featureless. It held in its hands a long length of heavy chain, and as the wizard squinted in the bright daylight, he could see that each individual link in the chain held a tiny rune. The stone man stepped forward and spoke. "You have made your way to Phycronus, traveler. You must proceed." It pointed to the tower. "I have every intention to, of course," scoffed the wizard. He stepped off the platform and waded halfway through the waters. He stopped to breathe the jasmine wind, savoring the sensations that immersed him. Gentle waves caressed his legs with a delightful coolness. He felt he could have spent eternity standing just there, and he would have been content. Yet, he knew he came for a purpose, and pressed onward. He crossed the pristine beach, climbed the hill of soft grass, and arrived at the door of the tower. The door shone pure white and pulled aside with little effort. Inside was a spiraling stone staircase, which he ascended without hesitation. Finally, he arrived at a chamber at the top of the tower. The room was circular in shape, and at its center was an altar made of polished marble. In the room stood someone who could hardly be described as a person, whose appearance and aspect could not fully be done justice with words. It was a being most fair, with flawless skin the color of pure snow. Its eyes were like diamonds and seemed to hold within them all the wisdom of the ages. It wore a flowing robe of a quality which surpassed that of the finest silks. Upon its head was a crown of exquisite platinum. The being's movements contained utter poise and grace, and its very presence seemed to radiate an aura of sacredness. The wizard's breath was stolen away. He tried to walk forward, but he was unable to complete even a single step. He fell to his knees, and tears ran down his cheeks. Never before had he witnessed such pure beauty, nor such stoicism. The being of light floated up to him and gently touched his face. "Why have you come to this place?" it said in a voice like a choir of angels. "I have come seeking enlightenment." His whispered words were barely able to escape his lips. For a moment, the celestial being paused, studying him and considering his response. "You lie." With that, it drew a curved sword, fiercely glowing. In the same fluid motion, it brought the blade down upon the trembling wizard, slicing him in two. An instant later, his body was taken up in a tremendous flare and reduced to a pile of steaming white ash. His consciousness did not fade immediately. He could feel a pain like heat beyond heat. It was a heat so scorching and pervasive, he was physically numb to it, and only in his soul could it be felt. It was a purging radiance, the core of a god star that could purify fire. And there he existed, burning in the spiritual fire and in his shame. After an unknown length of time, he was suddenly aware of the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. The wizard looked around and saw he stood upon the large disk of stone once more, rising out of the small bay. A storm raged all around, and a cold rain fell from the clouds above. Murky, angry waters slapped themselves against a shore that was littered with debris. Just beyond, there was a hill covered in briar patches, swaying in the storm winds. Atop the hill was a rugged tower made of granite, and at the top of the tower, a lantern light cast a stark green. He was not alone. Nearby on the platform was the stone creature he recognized from before. It stepped forward and spoke. "You have made your way to Phycronus, traveler. You must proceed." It pointed to the tower atop the hill. The wizard furrowed his brow and demanded an explanation. The stone creature's posture changed, preparing to lash out with its chain. Not wanting to provoke the strike, the wizard held out his hands in protest and hurried forward to be on his way. He came off the platform into the rough waters. He struggled against dark waves which showed no mercy. As he reached the shore, a sting shot through his ankle. He pulled himself onto the beach and saw a barbed tentacle attached to his lower leg. He grabbed a heavy stick that was close by and swung desperately. After a few hard whacks, the assailant retracted its bruised appendage back into the roiling waters. He stood and limped across the debris-strewn sand. He slowly ascended the hill, which was somewhat steeper than before. As he went, the briar thorns tore at his now tarnished robe. and stabbed at his skin. He reached the base of the dour spire and saw a heavy wooden door. He threw open the door and stepped inside. He shivered, casting chilly drops to the floor while his breath labored. He lingered for but a minute more, then began climbing the stairs. Finally, he arrived at the chamber at the top of the tower. The room was adorned with the furs and skins of various beasts, many of which still had faces locked in eternal expressions of savagery. At the far end of the room was a roaring hearth, and at its center was an altar cut roughly from a boulder. In the room stood someone who rattled the wizard's nerves. He was a bear of a man, a fortress of muscle, clothed in bristling fur and thick animal hides. Antler-like growths sprouted from his head and twisted in every direction. His eyes were like emeralds and seemed to hold within them the might of an entire army. With thundering steps, he advanced closer to the robed visitor. The wizard had been confused and angry when he had arrived at the stone platform once again, but the exhaustion of his trek and the intimidating presence of the horned man had shifted his spirit. He merely stood there, wet, shaking, breathing hard. "Why have you come to this place?" the great man growled. The wizard pondered his response. "This realm is far mightier than any I have ever known. I am now aware my abilities are trivial by comparison. I come to learn of this power. I come seeking strength." The horned man reached out and grabbed the wizard by his neck. He then pulled a hefty club from out of his furry mass. He lifted the club on high. "No, please!" the wizard screamed his plea. "You speak with a twisted tongue, from a poisoned mind." The man's stout arm brought the club crashing down upon the wizard's legs. Bones shattered like a pane of glass struck by a falling tree. He cried out in agony, and the man threw him upon the altar of stone. "You know nothing of pain, you know nothing of truth, and you know nothing of yourself." The shouts of the man seemed as if they were the breath of a hurricane. "What do you want me to say? I'll do whatever you want." The wizard's anguished cries could barely be heard over the storm that filled the chamber and flowed out of its windows into the gale. "I will show you yourself." The horned man produced a knife of obsidian and thrust it into the wizard's chest. He cut out the wizard's heart and held it before him. "This is the heart of a coward. It does not even fit to be eaten by a mongrel. I cannot stand the sight of it." With that, he flung the heart into the fire of the hearth, where it smoldered and popped. The wizard could feel his heart being burned away. And again, he faded into the ethereal cloud of his soul. There he could hear his very spirit wailing, and the wailing seemed to have no escape. It could only dash against a wall of solid rock. Again and again he tried to break through the barricade, but all was in futility. After an unknown length of time, he was suddenly aware of the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. The wizard looked around and saw that once again he stood upon the stone platform. The sky was a rolling mass resembling smoke, and from it fell clouds of ash. What once had been water now was a body of sickly colored liquid. Fumes rose from the mire and greeted his nose with stings. The shore was now a swath of mud. The hill beyond was a collective formation of jagged stones. Atop the hill was an iron tower which had spikes jutting from it like spears. The top of the tower was marked by a small point of crimson light. As he expected, he was not alone. Nearby on the platform was the stone creature bearing the rune-inscribed chain. It stepped forward and spoke. "You have made your way to Phycronus, traveler. You must proceed." It pointed to the tower atop the hill. The wizard could not bear the thought of going back to the tower, which looked absolutely grim at this point. "There has been a mistake. Please, you must listen to me. I realize I am not worthy of this place, and I only wish to leave." The wizard's words were filled with despair and aching, but they were met with stony indifference. The creature reeled its flail, then struck out with it. It lashed the wizard painfully, leaving bruises and welts. The chain wrapped itself like a constrictor around his legs. With the power of a giant, the stone man hurled the wizard off the platform. He landed in the miasmal liquid with a thick splash. It was like landing in runny tar. The slimy liquid clung to him, and it burned with acidity. This jolted him into action, and he struggled forward through the sludge with painful strokes. He toiled, grunting terribly as he went, until he crawled upon the mud of the shore. He stripped off his robe and rolled in the stinking muck of the beach, desperate to get the slime off. By the time the burning had subsided to a tolerable level, patches of his body were red and nearly skinless. He staggered up the winding hillside. Sharp-edged rock formations thrust defiantly upwards at various angles. The ground itself was covered in jagged rubble. He began his ascent slowly and tediously. He stumbled every now and again, and his palms became bloodied from catching his falls. His shoes had nearly fallen apart, and his feet throbbed from numerous rocky stabs. He reached the base of the metal tower and found a black iron door. He pulled open the door and went inside, beginning the painful climb. Finally, he arrived at the chamber at the top of the tower. The room had sheeted metal for floor, walls, and ceiling. The ceiling itself was covered in spikes, pointing downwards menacingly. To one side of the room was a brazier, in which burned smoking coals, and at the center of the room was an altar fashioned from studded iron. When the wizard saw her standing there, he immediately looked away. The being seemed to be the very embodiment of malice and wickedness. She was a woman, or like a woman at least. She stood naked, except for a dark belt around her waist, from which hung assorted implements of torture. Her skin was gray and smudged with grime. Instead of hair, a mass of writhing vipers encircled her head. Her eyes were like rubies, and they looked as though they had witnessed every act of cruelty since time immemorial. Wherever she cast her gaze, shadows deepened, and the air became hard to breathe. The wizard was in pain and crippled with terror. His wobbling head turned in the woman's direction, though he was unable to meet her stare.
"Why have you come to this place?" the monstrous woman asked.
Her voice slithered into his mind and remained. He answered, with a shaky voice that contained only a hint of hope. "I am a liar and a coward. This I have learned so far, but I know very little. I have come seeking to know myself." The woman cracked a bit of a crooked smile.
"Very well. You shall know yourself."
She gestured for him to approach. The wizard hobbled forward on wounded feet. She sat him on the altar and walked behind him. There was a sound of quiet hisses, then a slight sting at the back of his neck. The venom acted quickly. It did not numb him, but he felt himself lose control of his muscles. As his form slouched, the woman guided him with her hands, laying him on his back, there on the altar of darkened metal. For a time, she played with him, using a set of razors. She savored his small waves of pain, his pleas, his tears. He tried to explain himself, explain that this is not what he intended.
"I know."
Her barbed scourge came down, tearing strips of skin away from his stomach. His cries were delectable.
"Tell me what you did to get the ritual tome. I want to know all the details."
Her voice ended with a snake's hiss. He was powerless to resist her. Her devices extracted agonies from his body he never knew existed. He was a well, and she drank from him deeply. He told her how he obtained the tome. Whenever he glossed over a detail, her spikes or her sickles would remind him to be more thorough. The wizard explained a great many things. He had gained the secret of the tome's protected location from a holy priest. The man's will had been astonishingly strong, bolstered by a most devout faith. The mind, however, ultimately relies upon a physical organ. Despite every desire for perfection, the bodies of men are subject to flaws and limitations. After failing attempts at deception, charming, and coercion, the wizard created a weakness in the man's mental bastion by summoning a worm inside his head that ate away at his brain. The priest, once a beloved leader at a rural temple, was left a mentally voided idiot. Next, he told of how he had tricked a thief into helping him steal the tome from its well-guarded vault. He had lied about the object's true nature, then left the hired burglar dead after the final spell trap they encountered discharged a wave of supernatural doom. The wizard had considered the corpse to be a convenience. He went on to explain how he had bribed good soldiers to indefinitely delay the investigation of the robbery, and that he had afforded the expensive ritual components by purchasing them through a black market dealer, someone whom he knew had committed murder in order to gain the stock. He recounted these disgraceful deeds and more to his captor. She pulled numerous confessions out of him. Then her expression changed. From the smoking brazier, she drew a fork which was as long as her forearm. Its red-hot tines glowed in the dim. He understood what was to come. Understood, but did not accept.
I beg you, no more. I will tell you anything you want to know.
His screams were weak, barely screams at all, more mutterings.
Tell me why you desired the tome.
I wanted power. I wanted knowledge. I wanted supernaturally long life. I wanted everything this hidden realm is said to contain. I wanted it all. I was corrupt.
He felt as though his admission of greed and lust for power was the most honest thing he had ever uttered. He felt it was his final breakthrough. She thought otherwise.
No,
she said.
No! What do you mean, no? How can I possibly reveal more? I have abandoned all pride and confessed all there is.
You have shed your pride, yes, but you cannot tell me the true reason why you desired the tome.
If there is a greater reason, then I know it's not.
Exactly.
Her lips twisted into a spiteful purse, and she thrust her fork with a surge of rancor. The burning skewer stabbed into the wizard's chest. Her strike was performed with a calculated precision, spearing the wizard in a location only one such as she could find. He did not die quickly. For hours, he lay upon that cruel altar, unable to move, paralyzed with pure torment. There was no telling when he perished, for the pain rang on like an unquenchable flame, and in the deepest recesses of his being, he knew suffering. Not merely his own, but the great suffering he had caused others. Every person he had contact with had been led to iniquity, dishonor, malady, or death. The realization sank in that these persons were not solitary figures. Each one was a hub, a member of a family or a community, and the suffering he had caused was a collection of waves rippling out upon noxious tides, affecting in terrible ways all those he had never even considered. After an unknown length of time, he was suddenly aware of the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. The wizard opened his eyes slowly and sorely to the sight of the familiar stone platform. The sky, though, was but a haze of shadow. Filling the area of the bay now was a sea of maggots. Their endless squirming and writhing created a drone which filled the sour, misty atmosphere. The shore was a compacted pile of bones. They culminated in a gargantuan hill, atop of which perched a leaning tower. The tower was constructed of rusted metal, and its top was jagged, with no true roof. He saw the stone creature nearby, but was unable to muster a single plea. He had lost all semblance of self. In its place was only hollowness. The stone man stepped forward and spoke. "You have made your way to Phycronus, traveler. You must proceed." It pointed to the tower atop the hill. When it saw the piteous wizard slumped in apathy, it lurched forward and wrapped him in the chain. It dragged him through the sea of maggots, and when he came out onto the shore, they had begun to burrow into his skin. The guardian towed him across the beach of bone. Not a word was shared. The last tattered remnants of the wizard's clothing were torn away. The stone creature pulled him up the hill and to the tower. At the base of the leaning, rusted husk of a building, there was an opening, a yawning mouth with no light within. The man of stone flung the wizard inside. Within the tower, it was pitch black. For a while, he lay crouched on the rusted floor. But he knew what he had to do. There was no escaping it. From somewhere up above, he could hear the echoes of thumping and scraping. He felt around in the dark and found the stairway. He climbed it blindly, guided only by instinct. Finally, he arrived at the chamber at the top of the tower. The room was a blasted ruin. There was no ceiling, and a bleak unlight granted the vestige of sight. At the center of the room was an altar of bone. In the room stood another person, another thing, a skeleton with a few strands of gossamer hair hanging from its head and bits of desiccated flesh clinging to some of its bones. Its eyes were black sockets like onyx, which held nothing but despair and death. The wizard paced in absolute defeat to the altar. He laid himself down upon it. The skeleton drew near.
"Why have you come to this place?"
Its voice rattled dry like a man's last breath. "I no longer know," he said, "but I must end it."
"You cannot know the end until you know the beginning."
As the skeleton said this, it reached out with a single finger and touched the altar. Large, rib-like bones clamped down upon the wizard, holding him in place. The skeleton held one of the wizard's feet in its cold clasp.
"What is the furthest memory you can recall?"
it asked.
"I remember learning of the ritual tome I used to get here. I remember anticipation and the hunger to harness the power of this place,"
he responded. The skeleton began to eat the wizard's foot, then his calf, then his thigh. It rent pieces of his limb, and the chunks of flesh and bone rotted away inside the thing's mouth. The decay of decades was brought on with every chew. As it ate him, he felt his memory becoming clearer, as if heavy veils were being lifted. With each bite, he felt smaller, simpler.
I remember what power was. The ability to control my world, to control others.
His voice came weakly, slowly. The skeleton had devoured both of his legs, stripping away with them facades of the mind and facets of ego. It moved to his left arm.
I remember what hate was. The yearning of death to something or someone.
He spoke, even as he felt the skeleton bite into his last remaining limb.
I remember what people were. Beings who lived pointless lives, who were empty shells of wasted potential.
He was now limbless and nearing unconsciousness from blood loss. The skeleton stepped around to the base of the altar and stared into the wizard's cracked eyes.
"Tell me," it commanded. "Tell yourself."
The wizard's lips parted, and he spoke for the final time.
I hated people and wished for the power to destroy them. In doing so, all could have been made closer to perfection. I wanted to set things right, to start it all over. I wanted the world reshaped in my image. This was a dream fit for a god, not a man. It is only now that I see this. There is no more blindness.
He died. This time, there was no fire, no burning. There was nothing. The skeleton split the wizard's skin and stripped it from his body. It then extracted his bones. Afterward, it turned to face the woman with gray skin and serpentine hair. It gave to her the bones and the skin. She, in her metallic tower, stretched the skin upon racks until it was taut. She rubbed curing mixtures into it, which toughened and preserved it. She tanned it in the smoking heat of the brazier, ground the bones into powder. When done, she turned to face the horned man. She gave to him the cured skin and bone powder. He, in his rugged stone tower, worked the powder. He combined it with a pulp, then pressed, dried, and cut it. He stacked the sheets, fitted them with the stretched skin leather, and bound it all tightly into a single tome. When done, he turned to face the celestial being. He gave to it the book fashioned from the wizard's body. In its alabaster tower, it filled the tome with markings. It carefully inscribed each page using heaven-scented ink and a quill made from the feather of a phoenix. When finished, it came out of its marbled tower, down the hill of gold, across the bay of crystal waters, and onto the disc platform. The stone guardian stood by, as if knowing. The tome was placed at the center of the platform. Before long, it had disappeared entirely back into the world.